Oh, hi! This week, we are making a project that I am so excited for. It's like I forget how much I love more cosplay-ish things until I make one, and it's all I can think about. It's just a complete obsession of mine. Like, I have been planning this specific thing for months, and every day it's just been on my mind. And I made a bag version of this that you can watch here if you would like. And that was actually a good test of quilting pieces together like this, because I've never made checkerboard, technically argyle panels like this. It's like leveled up color blocking. I was much more confident about piecing this together. Maybe a little too confident at some points, which we'll touch on. But spoiler alert, I'm very happy with how this came out, and I might have welled up a little bit. So if you would like to join me on the journey to making this Howl's Moving Castle jacket, then let's get into it. Now, there were definitely some hiccups along the way, and the first one happened before I even started the project, which was after hunting and scouring for the right color fabrics. I got what I thought was the correct amount of each color. I'm doing another one of the Bertha Cardigans from the Tilly and the Buttons book. I have altered the pattern to make the bottom of it hang a little bit lower on me because I'm just forever tall. I do typically have to lengthen Tilly and the Buttons patterns. I obviously enjoy sewing these, as I have made so many of them. If you're wondering, they're from the Make It Simple book that she put out. And yeah, I've genuinely probably made about 25 of these by now, so I'm very familiar with the pattern. And I've done some amounts of color blocking, and I really thought I had the math down to do the piecing for these panels, right? I was like, okay, I need equal parts blue and pink. There's really long pieces that are going to need to be out of the yellow, so I'm going to get extra yellow. So I got half a yard of each pink and blue, and then a yard of the yellow. Then I realized part of the garment that I didn't account for are the very prominently pink sleeves. So right out the gate, I had to pause on this project, and this did get me to jump into the fox dress that I made last week. I was really, really motivated to make a thing, and though I was excited to do the Howl's Moving Castle jacket, I also know that I had all the material to do this fox dress and had also been sitting on that for probably 4 times as long as I have this cardigan. Happy with that. If you want to see how that came out, I'll put a card up here. It was my first time making a button down, button up. Does it ever matter? Are they both interchangeable? Does one indicate something else? I'm overthinking this, aren't I? But yeah, I had never made like a full button-up dress, and now I want to make 10 more of them. Thankfully, I had a pretty easy time finding some fabric that was enough yardage, because I ended up needing a full yard of a pink color. And I remember that when I made the quilted bag that I preferred the kind of salmony pink over like a baby pink, which was the original half yard. That didn't end up being enough, so this actually worked out for the better. The only thing was, it wasn't like the exact same brand type of fleece. I got it at a different store, like fluffier on one side after I washed it, so I did end up flipping that fluffier side towards the inside so everything kind of has the same texture to it from the outside. So first step, just to get it out of the way because it burned me before, was cutting out the sleeves, because I think they're the biggest pieces out of this entire pattern. Then I decided how big the squares were going to be for the checkerboard pattern, and I went with 4.5. Once you take seam allowance off of it, they'd be down to 4-inch squares, and it just seemed like a good amount of space to fill. It wouldn't be a ton of teeny tiny checks that would take ages and ages to put together, but also not so big that you don't really even get to see a good pattern on the panels. What my heart was telling me, my inner Calcifer. So to start with, I cut 4 strips, 4.5 inches wide, and just as long as I could go. I believe this is 60-inch wide fabric. Then I grabbed the blue fabric and realized how much the ends were getting tapered down because the selvage was on there, where some fabrics it doesn't matter as much as others. Thick stretchy knits tend to be more impacted by selvage like this, so I trimmed that off, and it kept it from doing that like narrowing towards the end. I did still need to square up one of the edges just for posterity's sake, and then I got 4 strips out of the blue. And then because I had it, I did cut 1 more strip, totaling 5 out of the pink, especially once I had laid out strips side by side to see how much I had, to get a general idea of like, is this actually gonna work, or do I already need to go and acquire more or different fabric somewhere? Slash, had it not been enough at that point in the day, I probably would have just given up and gone on to something else. I needed a win before I could handle any more losses, you know? And before I got too ahead of myself with the checkerboard strips and everything, I did cut out all of the yellow pieces just to have that part done. Again, make sure I did in fact have enough for everything. I had plenty, where it does seem like buying a whole yard just to get these small sections out of it might feel like overkill, but it is important with stretch fabrics in particular to make sure you're following the grain line. So I have this line with 2 arrows on it on the pattern pieces, and that indicates to me how the pattern piece needs to be laid out, and that line needs to be parallel to the selvage edges. For example, these pieces will get some stretch going across, which especially for the cuffs and the bottom waistband is fairly important. Then it's time to go over to the machine, which I did switch to white thread because all these are fairly light colors, especially against the yellow and the pink. White thread wouldn't show up too much, where had I picked yellow, blue, or pink to go with, it would have been super visible on all the other colors, so I just didn't want to even get into that. There only ended up being one spot where there was some top stitching, so white was definitely the move for these shades. I also made sure I had my walking foot on my machine because that's really helpful for moving bulky and also stretchy fabric through the machine and not getting chewed up underneath the bobbin casing, or just not feeding through the machine because it's too much heft to get through. Walking foot just saves a lot of grief there. And I also switched to a zigzag. So for any lines of sewing I did where I was attaching something together, I used a 2.5 stitch length, and similarly like right in the middle of the dial for the stitch width, because I find that more stitches get skipped when I try to do super wide zigzag stitches through bulkier fleece like this, so it just avoids all of that. Your machine might handle it better. I did also switch all of my thread on my serger over because that's what I used to finish all of the seams. All right, once I had everything threaded up properly, I decided it was time to start adding the strips of the pink and blue together. So I just alternated, made sure I had right sides together. Again, I decided to have the less fluffy side of the pink be the right side, so if it looks like I'm sewing it backwards, it is intentional, but it's not like I never do that. It's a fair concern to have as you're watching these videos. I had already cut the selvage edges off of the blue fabric, but I hadn't done that for the pink, and I don't know why I didn't just do it at my cutting table. So as I lined up each of the pink strips to the blue here, I snipped them off. I don't know if it's because the pink is a little bit thicker or it's just that it's slightly less wide on the bolt, but all of the blue strips ended up being that little bit longer. At least each strip was equally as long, because at first I thought like I just warped one of the pieces while I was sewing them together and stretched one too far and was going to make things wonky. But no, it's just how the fabric was laying. These extra flaps of blue came in very handy later on, but we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. Once I had all of those rows sewn together, I did some finger pressing. Now I could have used my iron, but because this is definitely a lot of polyester, I didn't want it to melt anything, and also I didn't want to lose any of the plushness. It's gonna hold fine just finger pressing it, so I made the choices I made. All right. Also, I was mulling over how to handle the finishing of those seams and was definitely leaning towards doing a lining, so I was also less concerned about those being like completely perfect on the inside. I also used this cool wooden tailor's clapper that Jeanette sent me. It was just very satisfying to do this part, use the smooth rounded side to kind of flatten things out, and I don't know, it was weirdly enjoyable doing this part. Like with the gathering stitches I did on the dress from last week, sometimes the tedious parts are worth it for the tactile experience. Okay, also every time I think of the word clapper, I hear in my head Eva Longoria saying slappa, trying to do it in like a Cockney accent. Obviously I can't do accents, and her character in this movie also couldn't really do accents, but there's a great movie that I think Lake Bell directed. She's the main character in it, at least, and Dimitri Martin's in it too, called In a World. I would super recommend it. I really thoroughly enjoy that movie, even though it's not even the same word Eva Longoria. Ava is saying. It's just what pops into my head. Should I name the clapper Ava? I might have to do that, actually. Anyways, once the seams were pressed open, I folded it in half and tried to make sure things were lined up evenly, and I cut, again, 4.5 inch wide strips. This is where I realized when you have an odd number of strips and then you go to flip them around, you have to offset them because both of the end pieces were pink for these, where the last time I did this kind of checkerboard pattern, I just had to flip things around because I had 4 of each color. One end was pink, one end was blue. So each time I flipped it, it immediately made it like a perfect alternating patchwork. So not that it was an issue having the extra pink, but again, having extra squares at the end of all of this was not the worst thing. And I do think having these extra little tabs here gave the little bit of extra wiggle room in 1 or 2 spots when I was cutting out the bodice pieces. So maybe it was for the best that I did it, but I don't know. It was a learning curve for me. I hadn't thought that through because I haven't really done this much before. Then what should have been the most annoying part of this whole project, I lined up every one of those seams and stitched them together at that 1/2 inch seam allowance and took my time, made sure everything was nice and even, making sure all the seams were laying open, and then assess the work. This seems to be the most satisfying part of doing this kind of patchwork situation. And then went right back to the cutting table and pressed all of the seams open the opposite direction. So basically opening them like over top the last batch of seams we opened. Everything should be laying flat. So took Ava Longoria back out and pressed everything open. Then it was time for the most intense part of this whole project, which was cutting out the front and back bodice pieces. So the back piece is cut on fold, so I wanted to make sure I had room for that first, and then figured I could finagle the front bodice pieces separately in whatever configuration worked. Thing is, I wanted everything to be mirrored, and everything had to get turned not 90 degrees, 45 degrees to make that argyle pattern versus checkerboard. So everything's going diagonally versus straight up and down. I don't know that I had to explain that to you, but just in case you're wondering what I mean when I say argyle, does this even count as argyle? I think it does, right? Or is there more specifics to it? Like when you're talking about plaids and tartans, I don't know that it's helpful to me or you to get into the weeds about this, but if there's more information to be learned about that, please let me know. I had exactly enough. I had exactly enough fabric in this checkerboard panel I made to make this happen. Everything was going to be symmetrical and beautiful and wonderful. And I cut out the back piece, and then I cut out one of the front bodice pieces. I really took my time with the second one because I knew how important this was. And then still, somehow, naturally, ended up cutting it out backwards, and I almost burst into tears. Where I had some happy tears happening. Like I welled up after I cut the back panel out because it looked so good. And then I almost walked away after the kerfuffle with the front pieces, but decided, no, you're gonna keep putting it off if you go to bed without fixing this. So I did very carefully and patiently took apart every row of that front piece, and I took every scrap I could find. This is where the extra squares of the pink and blue came in super handy. It's a little like tabs that were flapping off, because I was able to just barely make this work and put together another front panel that did in fact mirror the other piece I had already cut out. So then I had a left front and a right front. Then I went to bed. Oh wait, just kidding. Before I went to bed, remember when I was talking about entertaining the idea of doing some kind of lining? Howl's jacket, if you've ever seen it, has a red lining to it. And David, another lovely bog troll here, gifted me this like sheer red fabric, I think a couple years ago by this point, and I still haven't used it for anything else. It is a woven though, so I was like, I don't know, it was definitely going to be enough for the lining, and I probably would have stuff left over. And then after I fixed the front bodice pieces, I was walking into my studio, and to the right is my fabric that's on like these little bolts that I put together, and to the left is my costume rack, and I was literally just like bracing myself against some of the garments on the costume rack, and my hand hit this cape I forgot that I had, because I don't often need a red stretchy cape for anything. It was this super lightweight, opaque enough for what I needed, though it hadn't been sheer. It also would have been fine. And yes, I would have to include these seams that were off to the side, but it was gonna work perfectly. So that was a stroke of luck. I don't know where this came from. It was definitely like given to me by somebody that was probably getting rid of a bunch of other stuff, or potentially I saved it out of someone's trash. So still technically got it from somebody else. Then once those pieces were cut out, I went to bed. Next morning, had a nice big breakfast, had some coffee. Cheers. This is actually the point where I changed over my serger threads, because I always need to be bright-eyed and bushy-tailed to deal with that, because I feel like something always goes wrong and I dread doing it. Like I will put off doing certain sewing projects because I know I have to change the serger thread. In the grand scheme of things, even if stuff goes wrong, it's still less than like 5 minutes to deal with it, but it feels like an eternity when I am like looking down the barrel of having to do it. So yes, now that we had all of our pieces cut, the prep I ended up doing before assembling everything was I put all of the bands and cuffs together. I just basted along the edges because everything was folded in half, so there were 2 raw edges to deal with, and there's so much going on with the patchwork fabric. I just wanted to have as little frustration as possible attaching pieces together. So basting that did the trick. Was the neckband, the hem band, and the cuffs. I had considered adding thumb holes to these, but I didn't feel like doing it, so I didn't. Then I lined the patchwork pieces with the lining, as you do, where I just laid them wrong sides together and basted around the edges. Again, really careful to make sure all of the seams were laying open, and this definitely did what I had hoped and just covered all of the seams on the back side of the patchwork pieces without adding much bulk or weight to this, because I definitely would not have added just panels of red fleece to the inside of here. So yeah, I did that for all 3 patchwork pieces. Then the most fun part, assembling everything. It always makes me laugh when people talk about sewing and how the actual running things under the machine is maybe 10% of the time you put into a project, because so much of it is the prep work and the cutting out and the pattern hacking and swapping out your threads and troubleshooting you cutting out a completely wrong pattern piece out of a very limited amount of fabric. One of the things I really like about assembling this together is that it's a raglan style sleeve outfit. I mean, it also batwing sleeve, which I don't think those are mutually exclusive. Dolman sleeve, is that another word for it? I think so. But rather than having back and front bodice pieces attached and then inserting a sleeve from there, you have the back piece, you attach the sleeves. I did notch which side was which here because I feel like I always mess it up anyway. And speaking of messing up, I made a whole deal about showing, like, making sure that the extra plush side of the pink is on the inside, and I'm not gonna do it right sides together. And then I immediately pinned it right sides together, or clipped it. I was using my little craft clips, which are very handy for knits like this. So then I had to swap all of that out and reflip it over. Once I finally had them in correctly, I stitched those together, and then I attached the front bodice pieces to the front of the sleeves. And then I serged all 4 of those rows together. Not together, I serged them separately, but at the same time. Batch sewing, you know? Like when you wait until you have a whole bunch of stuff to press out at the same time, and then you go and do it, and then you come back to the machine. I try to do that with serging, even though it literally involves me turning 45 degrees, if that. Then it was just sewing up the side seams and underarm seam, and then attaching the cuffs and the bands, where the only thing I have to make sure I keep in mind when I'm doing one of these is that the hem band goes on before the collar band. Before I did 25 of these, I always swapped which one got done first. So I was very excited that the assembly of this went really smoothly once I was finally sewing pieces to other pieces. This part went really quick. I kind of just got in the zone. I don't think I showed any other steps along the way. I serged each seam as I finished stuff, and then it was done. I have just been staring at it for almost 24 hours because I can't wrap my head around the fact that I made it. This is like a real tangible thing that I have now, and I did it. This feels very cool. And I had even ahead of time scoped out where I was going to take photos of this and did some like practice photoshopping stuff to edit out parts of the background. Fingers crossed the post-production on this actually goes as okay as I hope it does. But let's jump to the reveal. So glad that I'm starting off this year with nice, big, ambitious projects that have been clunking around in my head for a while, because I'm definitely getting better and better every month that I'm doing this, and I'm able to get the idea that I'm picturing in my head out into the world. Like, this is a real thing that exists now that I sketched out on my laptop a couple months ago, and that doesn't feel terrible. And the only reason I'm able to do this every week and go out and buy emergency fabric because I messed up with the first amount that I didn't math out very well is because of everyone over on Patreon. Y'all are making this happen. Your support over there allows me to set aside time to do all this, and also gives me a budget to get material for this and the tools I need to make things like this happen. And even like the educational stuff, like the books that I got this pattern from and learned how to make this through. Y'all make this possible for me, and I get to do my dream job. And also a quick thanks to anybody that went over to my Ko-fi page. I know I don't mention that one as often, but I also know that Patreon can be a little daunting because it is like a monthly recurring subscription thing where Ko-fi can just be like a one-time deal. And yeah, that's gonna do it for me. Normally I would say I'll see you next Friday with another video, but we're gonna skip next week and move on to the week after that, which is gonna be Friday, February 3rd, where y'all allow me to take that 1 week from posting a video every month, and I get to dedicate that time to the 2 events I'm doing, Saturday and Sunday, so the 4th and the 5th, because I'm unhinged and I've gone a whole month not doing any events, so now I'm like chomping at the bit to get back into it. So yes, I will see you back here in 2 Fridays. Thank you so much for hanging out. Because you don't say salmon, you say salmon, because the English language makes 0 sense almost all the time.